The sun hung low over the Colorado plains, casting long shadows across the weathered boards of Thomas Caldwell's porch. He sat there most evenings now, watching the horizon swallow another day, his left hand trembling slightly as it always did since Antietam. The tremor wasn't from age. At 43, he still had the strength to work his small ranch alone. It was the war that had left its mark, etched deep in flesh and deeper still in memory. Thomas lifted the letter again, squinting at his own cramped handwriting. He'd written and torn up a dozen versions before settling on this one. Even now, with the envelope sealed and ready for tomorrow's mail coach, doubt gnawed at him like a coyote at Old Bones. "Dear Miss," he'd written, not knowing who might answer his advertisement in the Eastern papers. "I am a man of simple means, seeking a helpmate for life on a Colorado ranch. I offer honest work, a sturdy home, and respect. I do not promise romance or wealth, only shelter, sustenance, and protection. I fought for the Union and bear the marks of it. If you seek adventure or passion, look elsewhere. If you need safety and purpose, I await your reply." The advertisement had cost him 2 months' worth of eggs and the pride of asking, but the silence of the ranch had grown heavier than his pride could bear. Not loneliness exactly. He'd made peace with solitude years ago. It was the weight of unspoken words, the burden of memories with no one to help carry them. Inside the cabin, everything sat in its place, orderly as a military camp. He'd built it all himself after mustering out, each board and nail a small victory against the chaos that still visited him in dreams. The main room held a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, one worn from use, the other gathering dust, and shelves lined with the few books that had survived his wandering years after the war. Thomas folded the letter and tucked it into his shirt pocket. Tomorrow, Sam Morrison would take it on the mail coach to Denver, and from there it would travel east to the marriage brokers who promised to match desperate souls across the vast distances of America. He wondered what manner of woman would answer such a plea. Probably someone running from something, just as he'd run west to escape the ghosts of dead boys calling his name in the Virginia mud. 2 months later, when the autumn air had turned sharp as a cavalry saber, Sam Morrison's coach brought an answer. Thomas stood in the dusty main street of Cedar Ridge, watching Sam sort through the mail pouch with deliberate slowness. "Something for you, Tom," Sam said finally, his weathered face carefully neutral. Everyone in town knew about the advertisement. In a place where gossip traveled faster than wildfire, Thomas's quest for a mail-order bride had provided weeks of speculation and not a few jokes at Murphy's Saloon. The letter felt heavier than paper and ink had any right to feel. Thomas waited until he was back at the ranch before breaking the seal, his thick fingers clumsy with the delicate paper. "Mr. Caldwell," it began in a neat, feminine hand. "I write in response to your advertisement. My name is Margaret Harper. I am 34 years of age, widowed these past 2 years. I seek not adventure but shelter, not passion but purpose. I have no children and no family remaining in Baltimore. I can cook, sew, tend animals, and keep accounts. I have known hardship and do not fear it. If you will have me, I can arrive by train to Denver in 1 month's time. I ask only for fare and your word as a gentleman that you are what you claim to be. Enclosed is my photograph. I await your response. Respectfully, Mrs. Margaret Harper." The photograph showed a woman neither beautiful nor plain, with dark hair pulled back severely and eyes that looked directly at the camera without coyness or fear. Something in those eyes spoke to Thomas, a wariness that matched his own, a strength forged in some furnace of loss he could only guess at. He wrote back that same evening, enclosing the train fare he'd saved from selling his best calf. "Mrs. Harper," he wrote, "I give my word as a gentleman and a soldier that I am what I claim. The ranch is modest but sound. The work is hard but honest. I will meet you at the Denver station on the 15th of October. You will know me by my Union coat and the scar across my left jaw. I am gratified by your response. T. Caldwell." The 3 weeks that followed passed in a blur of preparation. Thomas repaired the loose boards on the porch, patched the roof where autumn rain had found a way through. and cleared years of bachelor neglect from the spare room. He even bought new curtains from Mrs. Chen's store, suffering through her knowing smile as she wrapped them in brown paper. "Getting ready for your bride, Mr. Thomas?" she asked, though the answer was obvious. "Just tidying up some," he muttered, paying quickly and escaping her good-natured curiosity. The night before, he was to leave for Denver. Thomas couldn't sleep. He sat by the dying fire, cleaning his Colt revolver by habit more than necessity. The weapon had served him through 4 years of war and 8 years of frontier living. He hoped Margaret Harper would never need to see him use it. But the West was still wild enough that a man who couldn't protect what was his wouldn't keep it long. He thought about the women he'd known before the war, Richmond belles in their silk dresses, farm girls at harvest dances, camp followers who'd traded comfort for coin and ration cards. None of them had looked at a camera the way Margaret Harper did, with that direct gaze that seemed to see through the lens to whoever might look back. Morning came gray and cold, with frost silvering the grass. Thomas saddled his horse and set out for Cedar Ridge to catch the coach to Denver. The letter from Margaret Harper rode in his breast pocket, next to a heart that had forgotten how to hope, but was trying to remember. At Murphy's Saloon, where the coach stopped to change horses. Several men had gathered to see him off. Some came to joke, others out of genuine curiosity. Bringing back a real lady. "Tom," called out Pete Hawkins, already deep in his cups despite the early hour. "Mind your manners when she gets here." Thomas replied evenly, "Any man who disrespects my wife will answer to me." The word wife felt strange on his tongue, like speaking a foreign language, but the men nodded, understanding the warning beneath the quiet words. Thomas Caldwell might be a man of few words and fewer smiles, but everyone remembered how he'd faced down 3 claim jumpers 2 summers back, his old service revolver speaking louder than any argument. The coach to Denver took 8 hours over roads that the recent rains had turned to a rutted challenge. Thomas sat wedged between a drummer selling patent medicines and a mining engineer heading to the silver fields, his mind already at the train station, wondering if Margaret Harper would be what her letter promised, wondering if he could be what she needed. As the mountains rose before them and Denver's smoke appeared on the horizon, Thomas Caldwell touched the letter in his pocket one more time. In 2 days, he'd be a married man. The thought should have terrified him more than any Confederate charge. But instead, he felt something he hadn't experienced since before the war, a quiet anticipation, fragile as frost but warming like spring's first thaw. The ranch waited empty behind him, but soon, God willing, it would echo with more than just his own footsteps and the wind through the chinked logs. Soon, perhaps, it might even become a home. The Denver Pacific Depot stood like a cathedral of iron and steam against the October sky. Thomas arrived 2 hours early, his best clothes already feeling foreign against skin more accustomed to work shirts and denim. The union coat he'd promised to wear hung heavy on his shoulders, its brass buttons polished but the wool showing years of careful mending. He touched the scar on his jaw, a parting gift from a Confederate bayonet at Cold Harbor, and wondered if it made him look fierce or merely damaged. The platform teemed with life, businessmen in derby hats, miners spending their dust on trips back east, families reuniting with tears and laughter. Thomas found a bench where he could watch the eastern approach and settled in to wait, his hat balanced on his knee, hands clasped to still their trembling. He'd seen death arrive on thundering hooves and whistling shells, but watching that iron horse approach with its cargo of possibilities felt like standing before a firing squad. The train wheezed to a stop in a cloud of steam and cinders, and passengers began spilling onto the platform like water through a broken dam. Thomas stood, scanning the crowd for a woman who looked like she belonged to the photograph in his pocket. Fashionable ladies swept past in bustles and feathers, followed by servant girls and salesmen, children and dogs. A whole world compressed into passenger cars and now expanding into the Denver afternoon. Then he saw her. Margaret Harper stood beside a single worn carpet bag, her traveling dress of brown wool, practical rather than stylish, her dark hair pinned beneath a simple bonnet. She wasn't searching the crowd frantically like some of the other arrivals. Instead, she stood still as a lighthouse, letting the chaos flow around her while her eyes moved methodically across the platform. When her gaze found him, the tall man in the union coat with the scarred jaw, she didn't smile or wave. She simply nodded once, picked up her bag, and began walking toward him with the measured steps of someone who'd learned not to rush toward anything that might disappoint. "Mr. Caldwell," she said when she reached him. Her voice carried a slight Maryland softness beneath its careful control. "Mrs. Harper." He touched the brim of his hat, then extended his hand to take her bag. Up close, he could see lines around her eyes that spoke of both laughter and sorrow, though he suspected the latter had etched deeper grooves. "The wagon's outside. It's a fair piece to Cedar Ridge. I expected as much." She studied his face without pretense, taking in the scar, the weathered skin, the gray threading through his dark hair. "Your letter was honest. I appreciate that. Seemed the only way to start." He led her through the crowd, noting how she kept pace without complaint despite what must have been days of train travel. "Are you hungry? There's a respectable establishment nearby if you'd like a meal before we set out." "Thank you. No. I'd rather see where I'm going before dark." She glanced at the sun, already tilting toward the mountains. "If that suits you." It suited him fine. The less time spent in Denver's curious gaze, the better. He helped her onto the wagon seat, noting the calluses on her palm as their hands briefly touched. Not a lady's hand, but a worker's. Good. The first miles passed in silence, broken only by the creak of wheels and the steady clop of hooves. Denver fell away behind them, replaced by the endless sweep of prairie grass turning gold in the autumn light. Margaret sat straight-backed beside him, her hands folded in her lap, taking in the landscape with those direct eyes. "It's bigger than I imagined," she said finally. "The sky takes some getting used to." Thomas guided the team around a rough patch in the road. "Maryland's different, I reckon. Crowded. Even the countryside feels closed in after." She stopped herself, but he could fill in the blank. After whatever had driven her to answer a stranger's advertisement and travel 2,000 miles to marry him. "The space helps," he offered. "When things get too much, there's always somewhere to ride where you can't see another soul." She turned to look at him then. Really look. And he felt the weight of her assessment. "You've been running from something too." It wasn't a question, so he didn't answer. But something in the set of his shoulders must have confirmed it. She nodded and returned her gaze to the horizon. "Well," she said, "perhaps we'll run together for a while." The road to Cedar Ridge wound through increasing wild country. Antelope bounded away from their approach, and a hawk circled overhead, riding thermals toward the mountains. Thomas found himself stealing glances at his passenger, trying to reconcile the photograph with the living woman. She was thinner than the picture suggested, her cheekbones sharp beneath skin that had seen too little sun, but there was strength in the way she held herself, even as the wagon jolted over ruts that must have rattled teeth already loosened by train travel. "There," he said, as they crested a rise. "Cedar Ridge." The town sprawled below them in the valley. Perhaps 24 buildings clustered around a main street that looked like a muddy scar from this distance. Smoke rose from chimneys, and they could see tiny figures moving between the structures. "It's not much," he added, suddenly aware of how shabby it must look to Eastern eyes. "It's a town," Margaret said simply. "With people and purposes, that's more than some places." They descended into Cedar Ridge as the sun touched the mountain peaks, painting them the color of blood and gold. Thomas had hoped to pass through quickly, but of course that was impossible. Mrs. Chen emerged from her store, Murphy from his saloon, even Reverend Hartwell from the small church at the street's end. They all wanted to see Thomas Caldwell's mail-order bride. Margaret bore the scrutiny with remarkable composure, nodding politely to introductions, deflecting personal questions with a skill that spoke of practice. When Mrs. Chen pressed about whether she'd found the journey difficult, Margaret simply said, "All journeys have their challenges, but I'm here now." You must come to tea when you're settled. Mrs. Chen insisted. So few women in town. We must stick together. That's kind of you, Margaret replied, committing to nothing. Thomas helped her back onto the wagon as quickly as politeness allowed, aware of faces watching from windows and doorways. Tomorrow the whole town would be discussing Margaret Harper's appearance, manner, and likely prospects as Mrs. Caldwell. Tonight, though, he just needed to get her home. The final 5 miles to the ranch passed in deepening twilight. The temperature dropped with the sun, and Thomas noticed Margaret pull her shawl tighter. There are blankets in the back, he offered. I'm fine. But her voice carried a shiver. He stopped the wagon anyway, climbing down to retrieve a wool blanket from his supplies. When he handed it to her, she hesitated before taking it. Thank you. She wrapped it around her shoulders, and he caught a glimpse of something vulnerable in her expression before she turned away. The ranch appeared as a cluster of shadows against the darker bulk of the hills. Thomas had left a lamp burning in the window, and its glow seemed both welcoming and lonely. The horses whickered, recognizing home, and picked up their pace. This is it, he said unnecessarily. Margaret studied the buildings, the main cabin, the small barn, the chicken coop, and storage shed, all arranged with military precision around a packed dirt yard. Even in the failing light, she could see the care in the construction, the way each structure stood square and true against the landscape. You built this? Every board. He couldn't keep a note of pride from his voice. Took 3 years to get it all up proper. It's good work. She gathered her skirts to climb down. Solid. He helped her from the wagon, then retrieved her carpet bag while she stood in the yard, turning slowly to take in her new home. The mountains loomed behind them, already lost to darkness, and the prairie stretched endlessly ahead. A coyote called in the distance, answered by another, and Margaret pulled the blanket tighter. Are there many? She asked. Coyotes? They're around but harmless mostly. It's the 2-legged predators you watch for out here. He hefted her bag. Come on, I'll show you inside. The cabin's warmth embraced them as they entered. Thomas had banked the fire carefully that morning, and it had held, needing only fresh wood to spring back to life. Margaret stood just inside the door, taking in the sparse, clean space with those observant eyes. Your room's through there. He indicated a door beside the fireplace. I've cleared it out best I could. There's water for washing, and the necessaries out back, but there's a chamber pot for nighttime. She nodded, still absorbing. Her gaze lingered on the empty chair at the table, the Bible on the shelf, the rifle mounted above the fireplace. It's a good home, she said finally. Better than I expected. What did you expect? A ghost of a smile touched her lips. Less. Men living alone usually accomplish less. He wasn't sure if that was a compliment or merely an observation. But before he could respond, she swayed slightly on her feet. You're tired, he said. Let me show you your room. We can talk about arrangements in the morning. The spare room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and hooks for clothing. The new curtains Mrs. Chen had sold him hung at the single window. Margaret set down her carpet bag and turned to face him in the doorway. Mr. Caldwell, Thomas, I want to be clear about something. He waited, one hand on the doorframe. I came here for shelter and purpose. As I wrote, I'll work hard, keep your house, share your burdens, but I need time before anything else. Can you grant me that? The lamplight caught the fear beneath her composure, and Thomas understood. Whatever had driven her here had left wounds as deep as any battlefield could inflict. You'll have all the time you need, he said quietly. I'm a patient man. Mrs. Harper, we'll take things as they come. Relief flickered across her features. Thank you, and please, call me Margaret. Margaret, then. I'll leave you to rest. There's bread and cold meat in the kitchen if hunger finds you later. He turned to go, but her voice stopped him. Thomas, the lamp in the window. Was that for me? He paused, uncomfortable with the admission. Seemed right. Nobody should come home to a dark house. When he glanced back, She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't read. "No," she agreed softly. "They shouldn't." He left her then, closing the door gently behind him. In the main room, he added another log to the fire and settled into his chair. The familiar quiet of the cabin now charged with awareness of another presence. Through the thin walls, he could hear Margaret moving about, the rustle of clothing, the splash of water in the basin. His wife. The word still felt foreign, but perhaps that would change. Perhaps they could build something real from this arrangement of mutual need. Perhaps two people running from their pasts could find a way to walk together towards something better. Outside, the coyotes called again, and the wind picked up, rattling the windows. But inside, for the first time in years, the cabin felt like it might someday be a home. Morning came with frost on the windows and a silence so complete that Margaret startled awake, momentarily lost. In Baltimore, dawn arrived with factory whistles and wagon wheels on cobblestones. Here, the quiet pressed against her ears like cotton. She dressed quickly in the cold room, grateful for the pitcher of water Thomas had left, though a skin of ice had formed overnight. Through the curtains, new, she noticed, probably purchased just for her, she could see the sun painting the mountains pink while the valley still lay in shadow. When she emerged, Thomas was already up, standing at the stove with his back to her. Coffee percolated, and something sizzled in a cast-iron pan. He'd changed into work clothes, and she noticed how he favored his left side slightly, some old injury making itself known in the morning cold. "Morning," he said without turning. "Coffee's ready. Breakfast in a minute." "I can cook," Margaret offered, feeling useless. "That's part of why I'm here. Tomorrow." He glanced over his shoulder. "Today you learn the house." She poured herself coffee, strong enough to float horseshoes, as her father used to say, and watched Thomas work. His movements were economical, practiced, a man who'd been taking care of himself for a long time. He set 2 plates on the table, eggs, bacon, biscuits that were better than she'd expected. They ate in silence that felt less awkward than it might have, broken only by the pop of wood in the stove and the distant lowing of cattle. "You have livestock," she observed. 40 head, give or take, some chickens, 2 horses besides the team." He sopped up egg yolk with his biscuit. "It's not a big operation, but it keeps a man busy. Show me what needs doing." After breakfast, Thomas led her through the house properly. The main room she'd seen last night, parlor, kitchen, and dining space all in one. A ladder led to a loft storage area. The root cellar beneath held preserves, potatoes, onions, supplies laid in with careful forethought. "Water comes from the well," he explained, showing her the pump in the kitchen. "In winter, we keep buckets inside so they don't freeze. Washing's done on Mondays if weather permits. There's a tub in the shed." Each revelation showed a life structured around solitude and survival. One of everything, 1 chair by the fire, 1 hook by the door, 1 place setting drying by the sink. Margaret wondered how long it would take for the house to acknowledge 2 people lived here now. "The chickens need feeding morning and evening." Thomas continued in the yard. "Eggs gathered daily. Garden's done for the year, but come spring we'll plant again." The barn smelled of hay and horses, warmer than the morning air outside. 2 horses occupied stalls, the team that had brought her from Denver. In the corner, a workbench held tools arranged with military precision. "Can you ride?" Thomas asked. "Some. It's been years. We'll fix that. Out here, a person who can't ride is half helpless." He ran a hand along 1 horse's flank. "This is Caesar. The mare's Delilah. They're good animals. Steady." Back outside, he pointed to various outbuildings, explaining purposes and routines. Margaret listened carefully, trying to map this new world. When he showed her the fortified corner of the barn, rifle ports cut at strategic angles, she couldn't help but ask, "Have you needed those?" "Twice. Indians once. Claim jumpers another time." His voice carried no bravado. "Just fact. It's peaceful mostly, but the territory's still wild. You should know that." I knew it when I answered your letter. He studied her face, seemed about to say something, then simply nodded. There's a rifle in the house, loaded, another in the barn. You know how to shoot? No. We'll fix that too. The morning tour ended at a small fenced plot behind the house. Wooden crosses marked 3 graves, the writing weathered but still readable. Bonnie, faithful friend. Rex, good dog. Captain, 1,868 to 1,875 inches. Your animals, Margaret said, understanding. Only family I had for a while. He looked embarrassed. Foolish, maybe, but it seemed wrong not to mark their passing. Not foolish. She thought of her own losses, unmarked and unmourned. Respect for the dead is never foolish. They stood quietly for a moment. Then Thomas cleared his throat. I'll be working the north pasture today. Checking fence. You need anything, ring the bell by the door. I'll hear it. He left her then, collecting tools and disappearing over a rise. Margaret returned to the house, rolled up her sleeves, and began the process of making it hers as well as his. The kitchen yielded its secrets slowly. Thomas had organized things for efficiency rather than convention. Flour and sugar in tins marked with his careful script. Dishes, mismatched but clean, stacked by size. A cookbook, spine broken from use, filled with margin notes in that same precise hand. She started with bread, the familiar rhythm of needing a comfort in this strange place. While it rose, she explored further. The Bible on the shelf fell open to Psalms, certain passages marked with dried grass, a volume of Shakespeare, water-damaged but readable, a farmer's almanac bristling with notes about weather and planting times. On a high shelf, she found a wooden box. Inside, letters tied with string, a woman's photograph, dried flowers. Margaret closed it quickly, recognizing the sacred when she saw it. Everyone had their ghosts. By noon, bread cooled on the table and stew simmered on the stove. She'd swept floors that didn't need sweeping, organized shelves already neat, trying to carve out space for herself without disturbing too much. When Thomas returned for the midday meal, he stopped in the doorway, nostrils flaring. Fresh bread. Among other things, she ladled stew into bowls, trying not to feel pleased by his obvious surprise. Sit, eat. The stew was good, she knew that, but Thomas ate like a man discovering food for the first time. When he reached for a third slice of bread, she had to hide a smile. Been a while since you had fresh bread? Been never really, not like this. He met her eyes across the table. Thank you. That afternoon, while Thomas returned to his fence work, Margaret tackled the washing. The pile of work clothes in his room suggested a man who'd rather buy new than wash old. She heated water, scraped lye soap, and set to work with a will. The repetitive labor freed her mind to wander, and she found herself thinking about the morning's tour. Thomas had built something remarkable here, a fortress against chaos, ordered and self-sufficient. But fortresses, she knew, could become prisons if you weren't careful. As she hung clothes on the line, movement caught her eye. A rider approached from the east, moving fast. Margaret's hand stilled on the wet shirt she held. Thomas had said the territory was mostly peaceful, but his tone had suggested mostly carried weight. The rider resolved into a single man on a bay horse. He slowed as he neared the house, and Margaret could see him clearly, younger than Thomas, wearing town clothes and a badge that caught the afternoon sun. The sheriff Thomas had mentioned. Ma'am, he touched his hat brim. Sam Morrison. You'd be Mrs. Caldwell? Margaret Harper. She didn't correct him about the name. Time enough for that later. Thomas is in the north pasture. I know. Saw him out there. Morrison dismounted, moving with easy familiarity. Thought I'd stop by, see how you're settling in. Tom's not much for visitors usually. Would you like coffee? That's kind, but no. Just wanted to say welcome. And he hesitated, then forged ahead. Tom's a good man. Keeps to himself. Maybe more than's healthy, but a good man. Steady. Reliable. You could do worse out here. Margaret heard what he didn't say, that Thomas's isolation worried his friends, that they hoped she might change things. I appreciate you saying so. You need anything, you let us know. Town's not far, and most folks are decent enough once they get used to you. He remounted, then paused. One thing, ma'am, there's been some trouble north of here. Drifters, mostly. But a few harder cases. Tom knows to watch out, but, well, you're new to the territory. I'll be careful. Morrison seemed satisfied. He touched his hat again and rode off, leaving Margaret to finish the washing with new thoughts to occupy her. Trouble to the north. Drifters and harder cases. She'd known the West wasn't civilized, but knowing and living it were different things. When Thomas returned at dusk, she mentioned Morrison's visit. His face darkened slightly. Sam worries too much. Always has. About the trouble north of here? Thomas washed his hands at the pump, taking his time. There's always trouble somewhere. Men who can't settle, won't work. Figure-taking is easier than earning. They mostly stay clear of places like this. Mostly. He turned to face her, water dripping from his hands. I won't lie to you, Margaret. It's not Baltimore here. Laws spread thin, and sometimes a man has to stand for himself. But I've held this place for 7 years. I intend to keep holding it. She handed him a towel, noting the scars on his knuckles, the calluses from work, and probably other things. I didn't come here expecting easy. No, I don't suppose you did. That evening, after another silent meal made less awkward by the quality of Margaret's cooking, they sat by the fire. Thomas worked on a harness that needed mending while Margaret darned socks from the washing pile. The domestic scene felt both foreign and oddly right. Your first husband, Thomas said suddenly. How long were you married? Margaret's needle paused. 8 years. Children? 2. They died young. Scarlet fever. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. But her voice suggested otherwise. And you? The photograph in the box? You found that. Not accusing, just observing. I wasn't prying. It was just there. Sarah. We were engaged before the war. She married someone else while I was gone. Can't say I blame her. I wasn't the same man who left. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, wind tested the windows, finding them solid. We're a pair, aren't we? Margaret said softly. 2 people with ghosts, trying to build something new. Maybe that's not the worst foundation. Thomas set aside the harness. We know what loss looks like. Makes us careful with what we have. She met his eyes across the flickering light. For the first time since arriving, she saw past the scarred soldier to the man beneath. Lonely, careful, but not without hope. Yes, she agreed. Careful can be good. Later, preparing for bed, Margaret found herself humming, something she hadn't done in years. The house still felt more his than theirs. But that would change. Time and work and careful trust would change it. Through her window, she could see stars brilliant in the clear mountain air. Somewhere in the darkness, coyotes called to each other across the vast spaces. But inside, the house was warm and solid, filled with the smell of bread and the promise of tomorrow's work. She'd traveled 2,000 miles to marry a stranger, and strange he remained. But beneath the strangeness lay possibility. 2 damaged people learning to move through the world together, carefully, carefully, building something that might last. The morning started like any other in the 2 weeks since Margaret's arrival. Thomas worked the east fence while she tended the chickens, their movements falling into an easy rhythm of shared labor. The October sun climbed weak and pale, offering little warmth against the wind that cut down from the mountains. Margaret had just gathered the eggs when she saw them, 3 riders cresting the hill that marked the ranch's northern boundary. They moved without hurry, but something in their approach made her stomach tighten. These weren't neighbors paying a social call. She set the egg basket on the porch and rang the bell 3 times, sharp and clear. Thomas had taught her the signals: 1 ring for meals, 2 for his attention, 3 for trouble. Then she stepped inside, leaving the door cracked enough to watch. Thomas appeared within minutes, moving fast but not running. His rifle carried loose but ready. He'd been a soldier. He knew how to read terrain and threat. He positioned himself on the porch, the rifle across his arms, waiting. The riders stopped just outside comfortable talking distance, the one in front, heavy-set with a week's worth of beard and clothes that had seen better days, smiled without warmth. "Morning, friend. Nice place you got here. State your business." Thomas's voice carried the same tone Margaret had heard him use on a snake they'd found near the chicken coop, calm but ready to strike. "Business? Just passing through. Been riding hard. Thought maybe you could spare some water for our horses." The leader's eyes drifted past Thomas to where Margaret stood shadowed in the doorway. "And maybe the lady could rustle up some grub. Been a while since we ate proper. There's a creek 2 miles west. Town's 5 miles south. They've got a restaurant." The second rider, younger with pale eyes that never settled anywhere long, laughed. "That's not very neighborly. I choose my neighbors careful." Thomas shifted slightly, the rifle barrel catching sunlight. "You'll find water at the creek." The third man hadn't spoken. He sat his horse like a sack of grain. But Margaret noticed how his coat hung wrong on the left side, the way Thomas's did when he wore his pistol. This one was the dangerous one. She realized. The talkers were just noise. "Now, see," the leader said, leaning forward in his saddle. "That's what's wrong with people these days. No Christian charity. Here we are, 3 tired travelers, and you won't even offer water." I offered directions to water. "But not your water, not your hospitality." His smile widened. "Maybe we should ask the lady. Bet she's got a kinder heart than you, friend." "The lady shares my opinion." Margaret heard the subtle change in Thomas's voice, the way it dropped and flattened. She'd heard that tone once before, when they'd encountered a rabid fox near the barn. Without being told, she moved to the window where Thomas had showed her he kept a loaded pistol. "That's so?" The leader looked past Thomas again. "Why don't you come out here, ma'am? Let us hear it from you. Miller's my name. These are my associates. Clement and Doyle. We're not bad men, just hungry ones. My wife's got nothing to say to you." The word wife seemed to amuse Miller. "Wife, is it? Heard in town you got yourself a mail-order bride. Must have been slim pickings back east. Her coming all this way to marry a scarred-up hermit." Clement giggled. An unpleasant sound, but Doyle just watched, still as a coiled spring. "You've got 1 minute to turn those horses around," Thomas said. "After that, I'll consider you trespassers." "Trespassers!" Miller's voice rose in mock outrage. "Hear that, boys? Man won't share water with fellow Christians, and now he's making threats." 40 seconds. Margaret wrapped her fingers around the pistol's grip. Through the window, she could see Thomas hadn't moved, but something in his stillness had changed. The lazy cat had become the patient hunter. "You know what I think?" Miller continued, enjoying his own voice. "I think a man who can't show hospitality don't deserve what he's got. Fine woman, good land, snug house. That's too much for one man, especially one who don't appreciate it." 20 seconds. "You won't shoot 3 men over water," Clement said, but uncertainty crept into his voice. "I won't shoot 3 men over water." Thomas agreed. "But I'll shoot 3 men who threaten my wife and my home." 10 seconds. Miller's smile finally died. "You're making a mistake, friend. We've got friends, more than you'd think. This ain't over." 5 seconds. "Come on." Doyle spoke for the first time, his voice soft and somehow more menacing than Miller's bluster. "Not today." They turned their horses, but Miller couldn't resist a parting shot. "You see that woman of yours? You tell her Josiah Miller asked after her. Tell her I'll be thinking about her. Lot of lonely nights out here for a woman when her man's not around." Thomas didn't respond, just watched as they rode north, back the way they'd come. He stayed on the porch until they disappeared over the rise, then came inside, moving quickly. "Pack food for 3 days," he told Margaret. "Ammunition too, just in case. You think they'll come back?" "Not today. Maybe not at all. Men like that are usually cowards when the odds aren't in their favor." He checked the rifle's load, then set it by the door. But Doyle worries me. He's got the look of a killer. Margaret's hands shook slightly as she gathered supplies. Should we go to town? Tell the sheriff? Sam's good, but his jurisdiction ends at the town limits. Out here, we're on our own. Thomas touched her shoulder briefly. You did well. Stayed calm. Got to cover. Have you been practicing with the pistol? Every day, like you showed me. Good. Keep it close for a while. They spent the rest of the day on edge, starting at every sound. Thomas worked close to the house, and Margaret found excuses to check windows. But the horizon stayed empty, and gradually the tension eased to a manageable vigilance. That evening, Thomas showed her more defensive positions, the rifle ports in the barn, the cellar entrance that could be barred from inside, the water barrels he kept full in case of siege. It painted a picture of a man who'd learned to expect trouble. Has this happened before? Margaret asked. Once or twice. Usually it's just talk. Men get liquored up, decide to test the hermit, see what he's made of. Thomas cleaned his rifle with mechanical precision. But these three were different. Sober, for one thing, and working together. Miller knew about me. From town. News travels. A woman coming to a place like this. People talk. He looked up from the rifle. I'm sorry. I should have thought... Don't! Margaret's voice came out sharper than intended. I knew what I was choosing. I've faced worse than crude men making threats. Something in her tone made him study her more closely. Your husband, the one who died, he wasn't kind to you. It wasn't a question. Margaret turned away, busying herself with unnecessary tidying. Kindness wasn't in William's nature. Whiskey brought out the worst, and he drank most days. Did he? Thomas stopped, started again. Is that why you answered my advertisement? To get away from his memory? Partly. Baltimore held nothing but ghosts and gossip. Creditors, too. William left debts along with bruises. She faced him again, chin raised. So yes, I ran, just like you did, but I'm not running anymore. No, Thomas said quietly. Neither of us is running anymore. They sat in companionable silence, the fire crackling between them. Outside, wind rattled the shutters Thomas had insisted on closing. The house felt smaller, with danger lurking beyond its walls, but also safer somehow. They were two instead of one now. Tell me about the war, Margaret said suddenly. Not the battles, just what it was like. Thomas was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, loud, that's what I remember most. Cannons sound like the world ending. And the smell, gunpowder and worse. Men crying for their mothers in a dozen languages. Were you frightened? Every minute. Anyone who says different is lying or crazy. But you learn to move through the fear. Do what needs doing. He stared into the fire. The worst was after. Coming home to a world that kept spinning while we were gone. People wanting to forget, move on, like it never happened. But some of us couldn't forget. So you came here. Seemed far enough, place where a man could start over, build something clean. He gestured at the room around them. Didn't figure on company. Disappointed? He looked at her then. Really looked. And something warm flickered in his eyes. No, surprised, maybe, but not disappointed. A coyote howled in the distance, answered by another. The familiar sound felt ominous tonight. Margaret shivered despite the fire's warmth. They're just calling to each other. Thomas said, finding their pack in the dark. Like Miller and his friends. Maybe, but we're not rabbits to be run down. This is our ground. We know it. We prepared for trouble, and we've got walls between us and them. He stood, checking the door's bar one more time. Get some rest. I'll keep watch tonight. You can't stay awake every night. Won't need to. Men like Miller. They'll make their move soon or not at all. Too lazy for a long game. Margaret rose, pausing at her bedroom door. Thomas, what you told them about me being your wife. We haven't, we're not really. Legal's what matters out here. We spoke words before witnesses in town. That makes it real enough for the law. He met her eyes steadily. Unless you're having second thoughts? No, No second thoughts. She surprised herself by meaning it. Good night, Thomas. Good night, Margaret. But neither slept well. Margaret lay listening to Thomas moving quietly in the main room, checking windows, adding wood to the fire. Once, she thought she heard horses in the distance, but it might have been the wind. Near dawn, she gave up on sleep and joined him by the window. He'd pulled a chair there, rifle across his knees, watching the lightening sky. See anything? No, maybe I was wrong. Maybe they were just drifters after all. But Margaret heard the doubt in his voice. Men like Miller didn't forget slights easily. They'd probe for weakness, wait for opportunity. The question was when, not if. I should teach you to shoot the rifle too, Thomas said. Pistol's good for close work, but sometimes you need reach. All right. He glanced at her, taking in her determined expression. You're tougher than you look. I've had to be. Yes, he said softly. I suppose you have. The sun crept over the mountains, painting the frost-covered grass with gold. Another day in this hard, beautiful country. Another day of watching and waiting, of building something worth defending. Margaret made coffee, strong and bitter. Thomas ate breakfast with his rifle close at hand. They spoke little, but the silence felt different now. Not the awkwardness of strangers, but the shared alertness of partners facing a common threat. Whatever came next, they would face it together. They came at dusk 3 days later. Thomas was in the barn, tending Caesar's thrown shoe, when he heard Delilah's warning whinny. Through the rifle port, he saw them, the same 3 riders, but moving different now. No lazy approach this time. They came spread out, professional-like, using the failing light and the terrain's dips to mask their numbers. He grabbed the rifle and slipped out the barn's back door, using the woodshed for cover as he made his way to the house. Margaret must have seen them too. The shutters were already closed, and he glimpsed the pistol barrel through the window slot. Stay inside, he called softly as he reached the porch. No matter what happens? Like hell, came her reply. And despite everything, he almost smiled. Miller's voice boomed across the yard. Caldwell, we come to continue our conversation. Seems you were inhospitable last time. Heard our feeling something fierce. Thomas positioned himself behind the porch's thick corner post. Turn around. Miller, last warning. Warning? Clement's high laugh carried on the wind. Hear that, Josiah? Man's giving warnings again. I heard. Miller had dismounted, using his horse for cover. Smart. Thing is, we've been asking around. Seems nobody'd miss you much, Hermit, but that woman, now she's different. Folks in town are curious about her. Doyle hadn't spoken, but Thomas tracked him moving to the left, trying to flank the house. The dangerous one. Just as he'd figured. Thomas shifted the rifle, keeping Doyle in sight while watching the others. Here's what's going to happen, Miller continued. You're going to put down that rifle and step aside. We'll have ourselves a nice visit with your woman. Take what supplies we need, and be on our way. Nobody has to die today. Counteroffer, Thomas said. You leave now, and I only shoot one of you. Which one? Clement asked, nervous bravado in his voice. Haven't decided yet. In the house, Margaret crouched by the window, heart hammering but hands steady on the pistol. Through the slit, she could see Miller behind his horse, Clement near the well, and where was the third one? Doyle had vanished from her line of sight. Glass shattered in the back bedroom. Doyle, trying for the house while the others held Thomas's attention. Margaret moved quickly, quietly, pressing herself against the wall beside the bedroom door. Footsteps on broken glass. The door creaked open. Doyle emerged, pistol drawn, scanning the main room. He took 2 steps before Margaret pressed her pistol to the back of his head. Drop it, she said, proud when her voice didn't shake. Doyle froze. In that heartbeat of stillness, she saw Thomas's training in her mind. If you point a gun at a man, be ready to use it. Hesitation kills. Doyle's shoulders tensed. He was going to spin. Try to shoot. The crack of Thomas's rifle split the air. Clement, who'd been creeping toward the porch, spun, and fell. Miller's horse screamed and bolted as its rider dove for better cover. Doyle used the distraction. Whirling fast as a snake, Margaret pulled the trigger. The pistol bucked in her hand, the sound enormous in the enclosed space. Doyle's shot went wild as he stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder, his gun clattering across the floor. "Stay down!" Margaret kept the pistol trained on him, though her hands now shook like autumn leaves. Outside, Thomas had moved, using Clement's fall to gain better position. Miller fired twice, splinters exploding from the porch rail. But Thomas was already gone, circling through the shadows he knew so well. "Clement!" Miller called. "Doyle, where the hell?" Thomas's second shot caught Miller in the thigh, dropping him with a howl. The outlaw tried to crawl toward his fallen pistol, but Thomas emerged from the darkness, rifle steady. "Don't," Thomas said simply. Miller collapsed, clutching his bleeding leg. "You bastard! You've killed us all." "Not yet." Thomas kept the rifle on him while calling out, "Margaret, you all right?" "Yes, Doyle's down but alive." "Clement!" Thomas moved carefully to where the younger man had fallen. Clement lay still, eyes staring at nothing, a spreading stain on his shirt. The war had taught Thomas to recognize death when he saw it. "One dead," he called back. "Miller's wounded. I'm coming in." He bound Miller's hands with rope from the porch, ignoring the man's curses and threats. The wound was bad, but not fatal if treated. Thomas had seen worse and survived. Inside, Margaret still held the pistol on Doyle, who sat propped against the wall, blood seeping through his fingers where he pressed against his shoulder. "You did good," Thomas told her, gently taking the pistol. Her hands immediately started shaking harder, the reaction setting in. "I shot him. You did what you had to." He checked Doyle's wound, clean through the meat of the shoulder. "Lucky for him. Both of you will live if you're smart about it." "This ain't over," Doyle managed through gritted teeth. "We got friends. They'll come looking. Maybe." Thomas began binding the wound with torn strips from Margaret's clean laundry. "But you'll be in territorial prison by then. Judge rides through next month. Until then, Sheriff Morrison will be glad for the guests." He looked at Margaret. "Can you watch them while I get the wagon ready? We'll take them to town tonight." She nodded, accepting the rifle he handed her. The weight felt different now, not just wood and steel, but the memory of violence, the knowledge of what she'd done, what she'd do again if needed. Thomas hitched the team quickly, experience and urgency making him efficient. He loaded Clement's body first, wrapped in an old blanket. Miller and Doyle followed, neither gentle in their handling. Both men had gone quiet, the reality of their situation sinking in. "You can't leave me here alone," Margaret said as he prepared to leave. "I wasn't planning to. Get what you need for a night in town. We'll stay at Morrison's until this is sorted." The ride to Cedar Ridge took place under a rising moon, the wagon jolting over rough ground. Miller moaned with each bump. Doyle stayed silent, watching Thomas with eyes that promised future violence if given the chance. Margaret sat beside Thomas on the wagon seat, still wearing her apron spotted with Doyle's blood. She'd grabbed her medical supplies and was already planning how to properly treat the wounds. Even men who'd threatened her deserved basic care. That's what separated decent folk from the other kind. Sheriff Morrison met them at the edge of town, lantern raised. He'd heard the shots, sound carried far on still nights, and had been expecting trouble. "Tom, that you? Got some deliveries for your jail. Sam, one for the undertaker." Morrison whistled low when he saw the cargo. "Josiah Miller and his boys. Been wondering when they'd try something stupid." He looked at Margaret with new respect. "Ma'am, you all right?" "Well enough." She climbed down from the wagon, legs stiff from tension and travel. "They'll need medical attention. Doc Harmon's still up. I'll fetch him." Morrison studied Thomas. "Self-defense. They came armed to my property, broke into my house. We did what was necessary. Good enough for me. Judge Cooper will want statements, but he's reasonable about these things." Morrison's face darkened. "Miller's been suspected in 2 ranch burnings up north. Never could prove it. You've done the territory a service. They spent the night in Morrison's spare room, neither sleeping much. Margaret finally dozed near dawn, her head on Thomas's shoulder as they sat in chairs by the window. He stayed awake, watching the street, rifle across his knees. Old habits. Doc Harmon reported that both wounded men would survive to stand trial. The town buzzed with news by breakfast. Some folks seemed impressed that the hermit and his mail-order bride had faced down 3 outlaws. Others whispered about violence following some people like a curse. "We should head back," Thomas said after they'd given their statements. "Stock needs tending." "The hands are scared," Margaret observed as they left town. "You could see it in how they looked at us." "Some people need the world to stay simple. Good people don't shoot other people, in their minds. Doesn't matter the cause." He guided the team around a washout. "You'll find some folks treating us different now. And you? Do you see me different?" Thomas considered the question. "You're stronger than I figured, but I suspected that from your letters. Takes a certain kind of strength to leave everything behind." "I didn't enjoy it," Margaret said quietly. "Shooting him, but I didn't hesitate either. What does that make me?" "Alive. It makes you alive." He glanced at her. "The first man I killed in the war, I threw up after, shook for an hour. But when the next battle came, I did it again. Not because I wanted to, but because going home alive mattered more than staying clean." Is that what this was? A battle? Of a kind. The war never really ends. Margaret, it just changes shape. Out here, it's outlaws instead of rebels. But it's still about defending what matters. They reached the ranch as the sun peaked. Everything looked normal. Peaceful even. But Margaret noticed how Thomas checked every building, every corner, before relaxing. The war might change shape, but vigilance remained constant. That evening, as Margaret cooked supper and Thomas repaired the broken window, a strange peace settled over the house. They'd been tested and survived. More than survived. They'd discovered they could count on each other when violence came calling. "Thank you," Thomas said suddenly, "for watching my back, for being strong when it mattered." Margaret paused in her stirring. "We're partners, aren't we? That's what partners do." "Yes," he agreed, something warm in his eyes. "That's what partners do." Outside, the coyotes began their evening chorus. But tonight, the sound didn't seem threatening. It was just the wild being wild. The world turning as it always had. Inside their house, their home, 2 people who'd known too much violence were learning that sometimes strength meant standing together against the darkness, and sometimes that was enough. The next morning, Sheriff Morrison arrived with Doc Harmon just as Margaret was hanging the wash. The lawman's face carried news, and Thomas set down his hammer to meet them in the yard. "Miller and Doyle are locked up tight," Morrison began. "But Doyle's been talking, trying to cut a deal, maybe." "Let me guess," Thomas said. "We're the villains in his story." "Something like that. Claims you shot first, unprovoked. Says they were just passing travelers looking for Christian charity." Morrison spat tobacco juice. "Course, nobody believes him, especially after we found stolen goods in their saddlebags from the Hendricks place." Doc Harmon cleared his throat. "I'm actually here for Mrs. Caldwell. If you've a moment." "Ma'am?" Margaret dried her hands on her apron. "Is something wrong?" No. Just wanted to check how you're faring after yesterday's unpleasantness. Such violence can affect a person, especially a lady unaccustomed to frontier ways." "I'm well enough." But Margaret accepted his examination, knowing refusal would only fuel gossip, while the doctor checked her pulse and asked gentle questions about her sleep and appetite. Morrison pulled Thomas aside. "There's more. Doyle mentioned others. Men they ride with sometimes. Could be bluster, but," he shrugged, "thought you should know." "I figured as much. Men like that run in packs. Want me to post a deputy out here for a spell?" Thomas considered, then shook his head. "We'll manage, but I appreciate the offer. Sam, After the visitors left, Margaret found Thomas in the barn, running his hands along Caesar's legs, checking for heat or swelling. "The doctor thinks I'm too delicate for this life," she said. "Are you?" "I shot a man yesterday. My hands were steady. Today I'm washing clothes and feeding chickens like nothing happened." She leaned against the stall door. "What's that make me?" "Human." Thomas straightened, his knees protesting. "We do what needs doing, then we move on. Dwelling on it serves nobody." "Is that what you did, after the war?" "I tried dwelling for a while, nearly drowned in a whiskey bottle before I figured out that moving forward was the only direction worth going." He led Caesar out to the corral. "The doc's not wrong, though. This life isn't easy. Neither was my life in Baltimore." Margaret followed him into the sunlight. "At least here, the dangers are honest. Men like Miller come at you straight. In the city, violence wore a smile and a wedding ring." Thomas stopped, really looking at her. The morning sun caught the silver threads in her dark hair, the fine lines around her eyes, beautiful in the way of things that had survived storms. "Tell me," he said quietly. So she did, standing there in the barnyard with chickens pecking around their feet. Margaret spoke of 8 years with William Harper, the charming suitor who became a tyrant, the first blow on their wedding night. The babies lost to fever while their father drank away the medicine money, the final beating that left her unconscious for 2 days, after which William had conveniently fallen down the stairs and broken his neck. Nobody questioned it. She finished. "He was known for drinking, for clumsiness, but sometimes I wonder if God pushed him, or if I did. The memory's fuzzy." "Does it matter?" She considered. "I used to think so. Now, no, he's dead, I'm alive, and that's the end of it." "Yes," Thomas agreed. "That's the end of it." They worked in companionable silence the rest of the morning. But Margaret noticed Thomas staying closer to the house, his rifle always within reach. The attack had reminded them both that peace was temporary in this wild place. That afternoon, Margaret was kneading bread when she heard horses. Thomas appeared in the doorway immediately, but relaxed when he saw who it was. "Mrs. Chen," he said. "And others." A small procession of townswomen had arrived. "Mrs. Chen from the general store, Mrs. Morrison, the banker's wife, Mrs. Hartwell, and young Amy Fletcher, who helped at the hotel. They carried baskets and determined expressions. We've come to call on Mrs. Caldwell." "Mrs.," Chen announced. "Properly." Thomas looked at Margaret, eyebrows raised. She smoothed her apron and stepped onto the porch. "Ladies, this is unexpected." "Nonsense." "Mrs.," Morrison said briskly. "You've been here weeks and we haven't done right by you. Too busy minding our own business, which is no excuse for poor manners." They swept inside, filling the quiet house with chatter and rustling skirts. Thomas retreated to the barn, but Margaret caught his small smile. He understood what this meant. Acceptance, or at least its beginning. The women had brought food. Mrs. Chen's dumplings, Mrs. Hartwell's apple cake, Amy's fresh butter. They admired Margaret's bread, exclaimed over her clean floors, and carefully didn't mention the boarded window or the rifle by the door. "We heard about the trouble, Mrs. Morrison said finally. "Shocking, but you handled yourself well, dear. Not every woman could have done what you did." "Any woman would defend her home," Margaret replied. "Perhaps, but not all would succeed." Mrs. Chen's eyes held approval. "My husband came from China 30 years ago. He learned to shoot within a month. Sometimes the frontier requires us to become more than we were." The conversation turned to safer topics: recipes, gardening, the coming winter. But underneath ran a current of understanding. These women had all made their accommodations with the West's demands. They'd learned to birth babies without doctors, bury children without priests, face storms and droughts and violent men. Margaret had passed some essential test. "You must come to the quilting circle," Mrs. Hartwell insisted. "Thursday's at my home. We're making a wedding quilt for the Olsen girl." "I'll consider it," Margaret said. which they all knew meant yes, after they left in a flutter of goodbyes and promises to visit again. Thomas emerged from the barn. Survive the invasion? Barely. But Margaret smiled. They brought food. Your favorite, Mrs. Chen's dumplings. Over dinner, she told him about the visit, the gossip shared, the connections offered. Thomas listened with the focused attention he gave everything, understanding the importance of women's networks in a place where neighbors might be the difference between survival and disaster. They like you, he observed. They're curious about me. There's a difference. No, Mrs. Chen doesn't waste dumplings on curiosity. That night, as they sat by the fire, Thomas mending harness, Margaret working on a shirt she was making him, she found herself humming again. The house felt fuller somehow, as if the women's visit had left echoes of life and laughter in the corners. I've been thinking, Thomas said suddenly, about what you told me, your husband. Margaret's needle stilled. You don't owe me any explanations, he continued. But I want you to know, I've never raised a hand to a woman, never would. That's not who I am. I know. And she did. In the week she'd been here, she'd seen his strength, but also his control. The careful way he moved around her, the distance he kept. I wouldn't have stayed if I thought otherwise. Good. He returned to his work, then added quietly, he got what he deserved, however it happened. Margaret felt something ease in her chest. A knot she hadn't known was there. Yes, he did. Later, preparing for bed, she found herself thinking about the day, the sheriff's warnings, the women's visit, Thomas's quiet acceptance of her past, threads weaving together into something that might, given time, become a life. Through her window, she could see Thomas making his evening rounds, checking locks and latches. He moved with the same purposeful grace, whether mending fence or facing outlaws. A man shaped by violence, but not ruled by it. Her first husband had gloried in causing pain. Thomas carried violence like a tool, necessary sometimes, but set aside when the job was done. The difference mattered. She was almost asleep when she heard it. Horses again, moving fast. Margaret was out of bed and reaching for the pistol before fully awake. But Thomas's voice came calm through the wall. Just Morrison, alone. The sheriff's news was brief. Miller had died in the night. Blood poisoning from the wound. Doyle was demanding a lawyer, claiming murder now instead of self-defense. Don't worry, Morrison assured them. Judge Cooper's dealt with plenty of Doyles. Your position's solid. Just wanted you to know. After he left, Thomas found Margaret in the kitchen, making coffee despite the late hour. Scared? He asked. No. Should I be? Miller's dead because he came here looking for trouble. That's on him, not us. I know. She poured 2 cups, handed him one. I'm not losing sleep over men who threatened us. Is that wrong? That's survival. He sipped the coffee, strong and bitter. Out here, right and wrong gets simpler. Protect what's yours. Help your neighbors. Keep your word. Everything else is details. They drank their coffee in silence. 2 people who'd learned the hard way that sometimes violence was the only answer to violence. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows Thomas had reinforced. But inside, the house stood solid, a refuge built by careful hands and defended by determined hearts. We make a good team, Margaret said finally. Thomas looked at her over his cup, something warm in his eyes. Yes, we do. The coffee finished. They returned to their rooms, but Margaret left her door open a crack, and Thomas didn't bar the main door. Small changes, but significant. Trust building alongside the walls that protected them. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Doyle's trial, winter preparations, the constant work of frontier life. But tonight, they were safe, together, and stronger for having faced the storm. It was enough. For now, it was enough. The man from Denver arrived on a Tuesday morning, his black carriage as out of place on the dusty road as a coffin at a wedding. Thomas was splitting wood when he saw the dust cloud approaching, and something in the purposeful way the vehicle moved set his teeth on edge. "Margaret," he called, setting the axe aside. "Company coming. Official looking." She emerged from the root cellar, potatoes in her apron, and shaded her eyes against the sun. "Government?" "Most like." The carriage rolled to a stop in their yard, and two men stepped out. The first was small and neat, with the soft look of someone who'd never missed a meal or split a log. The second was hired muscle, his hand resting casual-like on a holstered pistol. "Mr. Caldwell." The small man consulted papers in his hand. "Mr. Thomas Caldwell, late sergeant of the 14th Indiana Infantry." "Who's asking?" "Josiah Pemberton, Territorial Prosecutor's Office." He produced credentials with a flourish. "I'm here regarding the recent deaths of Josiah Miller and Clement Walsh. Already gave my statement to Sheriff Morrison." "Yes, I've read it. Quite the tale of heroism." Pemberton's smile was thin as paper. A man single-handedly defeating 3 armed desperados, almost like something from a dime novel. Margaret stepped forward. "It wasn't single-handed. I shot Doyle." "Ah, yes, the mail-order bride who turns out to be a crack shot. How convenient." Pemberton made a note. "Tell me, Mrs. Harper, is it? You haven't actually married Mr. Caldwell legally, have you?" "We spoke vows before witnesses," Thomas said evenly. "But no certificate filed, no official ceremony. Interesting." More notes. "And you, madam, arrived from Baltimore recently? A widow, I understand. What's this about?" Margaret demanded. "It's about justice. Mrs. Harper, 2 men are dead, another maimed. The territory takes such violence seriously." Pemberton's eyes glittered. "Especially when the perpetrator has a history of killing." Thomas went very still. "Meaning?" "Your war record, Sergeant, quite impressive. 17 confirmed kills at Antietam alone. Citations for aggressive action at Cold Harbor. A man who's developed a taste for blood. Some might say. That was war. Was it? Or did you simply find socially acceptable outlets for violent tendencies?" Pemberton circled them slowly, his bodyguard following. "And now, retire to this isolated ranch. You continue the pattern. How many men have you killed since coming here, Mr. Caldwell? Men who threatened me and mine." "So you say, but dead men tell no tales, do they?" Pemberton stopped in front of Margaret. "Did you know about his past when you answered his advertisement? Or did you discover too late that you'd bound yourself to a killer?" "I knew he was a soldier," Margaret said firmly. "An honorable man who served his country." "Honorable, yes. Like when he shot those Confederate prisoners at—" "That's enough." Thomas's voice carried the edge it had when facing Miller. "State your business or get off my land." Pemberton smiled, pleased to have drawn a reaction. "My business is simple. The territory is civilizing. Mr. Caldwell, we can't have former soldiers treating every dispute as a battlefield. I'm recommending charges be filed for the murders of Miller and Walsh." "Murders?" Margaret stepped between them. "They broke into our home." "According to you, but you're hardly an impartial witness, are you? Living here unmarried, sharing whatever arrangement you have." His implication hung ugly in the air. The bodyguard shifted, hand moving toward his gun as Thomas took a step forward. But Margaret caught his arm. "Don't! That's what he wants." Pemberton's smile widened. "Wise woman. Violence won't solve this. Sergeant, you'll need to answer to the law, not the gun." He turned toward his carriage. "I'll be staying in Cedar Ridge for the investigation. I suggest you don't leave the area." "Investigation of what?" Thomas demanded. "Why, of you. Of course. Your past. Your present. Every man you've killed or maimed. Every complaint filed." He paused at the carriage door. "Did you know Josiah Miller had a brother? Quite prosperous. Back in Denver. He's very interested in seeing justice done." After they left, Thomas stood rigid in the yard, fists clenched. Margaret had seen him face armed men with less tension. "He can't prove anything," she said. "Everyone knows Miller was an outlaw. Doesn't matter what everyone knows. Matters what a judge believes." Thomas finally moved, gathering the split wood with sharp, angry movements. And Pemberton's right about one thing. I have killed men, maybe too many. In war, in self-defense. The reason doesn't bring them back. He threw wood onto the pile with unnecessary force. Doesn't stop me seeing their faces. Margaret caught his arm, stilled his motion. Look at me. He did, reluctantly. You're not a killer. You're a man who's done what was necessary to survive and protect others. There's a difference. Is there? Pemberton doesn't think so. Neither will a Denver jury if he gets his way. That evening, Sheriff Morrison arrived with troubling news. Pemberton had been all over town, asking questions, taking statements from anyone who'd listen. He's got a few people talking, Morrison admitted. Jake Fuller's still sore about that dispute over water rights 2 years back, and the widow Thompson mentioned you scared off her boy when he came courting her daughter. Her boy was drunk and wouldn't take no for an answer. Thomas said flatly, I know that. But Pemberton's painting a picture. See? The violent hermit who threatens anyone who crosses him. Morrison accepted the coffee Margaret offered. He also found out about Baltimore. Margaret's cup rattled against its saucer. What about Baltimore? Your husband's death. The questions around it. Morrison looked apologetic. Pemberton suggesting you two make a matched pair. Violent souls drawn together. That's ridiculous, Margaret said, but her voice shook. Maybe, but he's from Denver, got authority, speaks well, some folks are listening. Morrison stood to leave. Watch yourselves. This isn't over. The next days passed in a siege of a different kind. Pemberton appeared daily in town, always with his bodyguard, always asking questions. He interviewed anyone who'd had dealings with Thomas, twisted their words, found grievances where none existed. Margaret went to town for supplies and found conversations stopping when she entered stores. Some people, Mrs. Chen, the Morrisons, stood by them, but others whispered, wondered, repeated Pemberton's poisonous suggestions. Maybe we should leave, Margaret said one evening. Start over somewhere else. No. Thomas's response was immediate. I built this place. We built this life. I won't be driven off by lies and legal trickery. Even if staying means hanging. He looked at her across the table. You could go. This isn't your fight. Isn't it? Margaret's laugh was bitter. He's investigating my past too. Besides, where would I go? This is my home now. Even with a man who might be the killer Pemberton says? She reached across the table, covered his scarred hand with hers. Especially then. The touch lasted only a moment, but something shifted between them. Not passion, not yet, but recognition. Two damaged people choosing to stand together against a world that wanted to break them separately. On Thursday, Margaret attended the quilting circle as promised. The reception was mixed. Some women welcomed her warmly. Others kept their distance. But Mrs. Chen pulled her aside with news. That Pemberton, he receives telegrams from Denver. My husband saw one, from someone named Miller. Continue pressure, it said. Money, no object. So Miller's brother was funding this persecution. It wasn't about justice, but revenge, dressed up in legal clothing. That night, Margaret found Thomas cleaning his rifle with obsessive care. We could still run, she said softly. I'm tired of running. He sighted down the barrel. Ran from the war's memories, ran from civilization, but it follows anyway. Then we fight, but not with guns. She sat beside him. Pemberton wants to provoke you. Every angry word, every threatening gesture feeds his narrative. We need to be smarter. How? I don't know yet, but there has to be a way. The answer came from an unexpected source. Reverend Hartwell arrived Friday morning, his usually mild face set in determined lines. I've been praying on this situation, he began without preamble. That Pemberton fellow interviewed me yesterday. Wanted to know about your spiritual state. Thomas, whether you showed proper Christian remorse for your violent acts. What did you tell him? The truth, that you're a man who carries his burdens quietly but honestly, that you've never gloried in violence. Hartwell paused. But I also did some asking around. Pemberton's not as clean as he pretends. Margaret leaned forward. Oh? Seems he left Kansas rather suddenly 2 years ago. Something about mishandled funds, charges that mysteriously disappeared. Hartwell produced a letter. My colleague in Topeka sent details. Thought you might find them useful. Thomas read the letter, his expression lightening for the first time in days. He embezzled from War Widows Fund, allegedly, but the allegations are detailed and damning. Hartwell stood. I'm not a fighting man, Thomas, but I know righteousness from persecution. This is the latter. After he left, Margaret and Thomas sat in renewed hope. They had ammunition now, not bullets, but information. We need to get word to Judge Cooper. Thomas said, and maybe some newspapers. Pemberton wants to try this in public opinion? Let's give him public opinion. That afternoon, while Thomas rode to the telegraph office, Margaret had her own visitor, the bodyguard, without his employer. Ma'am. He touched his hat. Name's Carlton. Wondered if I might have a word. Margaret kept the door between them. About what? About my employer, and whether you folks might need someone who knows his habits. Carlton's weathered face showed disgust. I've done plenty I ain't proud of, ma'am, but hounding decent folk on a rich man's grudge, that sticks in my craw. Why should we trust you? Because I was at Antietam too. Different unit, but I was there. He met her eyes. I know what those days did to men. Your husband ain't no murderer. He's just trying to live with what we all carry. Margaret made a decision. Come in, Mr. Carlton. Tell me everything. By evening, the tide had begun to turn. Carlton provided details about Pemberton's communications with Denver, his plans to bring in hired witnesses, his drinking habits that loosened his tongue about past misdeeds. Thomas returned with news that Judge Cooper was very interested in the Kansas allegations. The territorial newspaper editor, always hungry for scandal, was even more interested. He overplayed his hand, Thomas said with satisfaction. Thought frontier folk would be easy to manipulate. He didn't count on them being loyal, Margaret added, or us being fighters of a different sort. That night, for the first time since Pemberton's arrival, they ate dinner without the shadow of accusation hanging over them. The battle wasn't won yet, but the momentum had shifted. Thank you, Thomas said suddenly, for believing, for staying, for being stronger than any soldier I ever served with. Margaret felt warmth bloom in her chest. We're partners, remember? For better or worse. Yes, he agreed, and his smile transformed his scarred face. For better or worse. Outside, a storm was building over the mountains. But inside, two people who'd learned to weather storms sat together, planning their defense not with rifles but with truth, courage, and the unexpected power of community. The frontier might be wild, but it also protected its own. And sometimes, that was the greatest justice of all. The scandal broke like a prairie thunderstorm. Within days of the telegraph messages flying between Cedar Ridge and Kansas, Pemberton's carefully constructed case began to crumble. The territorial newspaper ran the story of his alleged embezzlement with barely concealed glee, and suddenly the prosecutor found himself answering uncomfortable questions. Thomas and Margaret watched from their porch as Pemberton's carriage departed Cedar Ridge in considerably less pomp than it had arrived. Carlton, true to his word, had provided damning details about his former employer's plans to manufacture evidence, combined with the Kansas revelations. It was enough to send Pemberton scurrying back to Denver. He'll try again, Thomas said, but without the tension that had gripped him for weeks. Maybe, but next time we'll be ready. Margaret stood beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. The whole town will be ready. Indeed, the attempted persecution had achieved the opposite of its intent. Where before, Thomas had been the hermit rancher, tolerated but apart. Now he was one of them, a neighbor who'd been attacked by outside forces and stood firm. The frontier had its own code, and Pemberton had violated it. Judge Cooper arrived the following week, and Doyle's trial was swift. With Miller dead and Clement buried, Doyle had lost his taste for lies. He confessed to the attempted robbery, admitted they'd planned worse for Margaret, and was sentenced to 10 years hard labor. He left Cedar Ridge in chains, and few mourned his departure. "It's over," Morrison told them afterward. "Miller's brother might grumble, but no prosecutor will touch this case now. You're free and clear." But freedom, Thomas and Margaret discovered, was more than just the absence of threat. It was what you built in the spaces fear had occupied. November arrived with its first snows, and they worked together preparing for winter. Thomas taught Margaret to shoot the rifle, patiently adjusting her stance, praising her improving aim. She taught him to laugh again, finding humor in daily mishaps, coaxing smiles from behind his defensive walls. One evening, as they sat by the fire, a habit now, this shared time after supper, Margaret noticed Thomas rubbing his left shoulder, the old wound acting up in the cold. "Let me," she said, moving behind his chair. He tensed as her hands touched his shoulders, then slowly relaxed as she worked at the knots years of pain had twisted into his muscles. Neither spoke, but the silence hummed with possibility. "Better?" she asked finally. "Yes." His voice was rough. "Margaret, I know." She returned to her chair, understanding. They were moving towards something, slow as seasons turning, but steady. "There's no rush." December brought deeper snows and a Christmas invitation from the Morrisons. The whole town would gather. They promised, a frontier celebration of survival and community. "Should we go?" Thomas asked, uncertain. Social gathering still sat uneasily on his shoulders. "I think we should." Margaret was hemming a new dress, her first since arriving. "We're part of this place now, both of us." The Morrison barn was transformed with lanterns and evergreen boughs. Half of Cedar Ridge crowded inside, escaping winter's grip for a few hours of warmth and fellowship. Fiddle music competed with laughter, and children raced between the adults' legs. Thomas stood stiffly at first, but Margaret stayed close, her presence anchoring him. When Mrs. Chen insisted he dance, Margaret nodded encouragement. He moved like a soldier at first, counting steps like rifle drills, but gradually found the rhythm. "You're doing fine," Amy Fletcher told him as they turned. "Margaret looks happy. That's what matters." He glanced over to where Margaret danced with Morrison, her face alight with pleasure, and felt something shift in his chest. When had her happiness become essential to his own peace? Later, as they prepared to leave, Reverend Hartwell approached. "Thomas, Margaret, a word?" They followed him to a quieter corner. "I've been thinking," the Reverend began. "You two spoke vows, but never had a proper ceremony. If you wanted, that is, I'd be honored to perform a real wedding, make it official in all ways." Thomas and Margaret exchanged glances. In the months since her arrival, they'd built a partnership, a friendship, something deeper than either had expected. But marriage, true marriage, was another step entirely. "We'll think on it," Thomas said finally. "Thank you." The ride home was quiet, both lost in thought. Snow fell softly, muffling the horses' hooves, turning the familiar landscape strange and beautiful. "Would you want that?" Thomas asked suddenly. "A real wedding? Would you?" He considered. "When you first came, I thought I was hiring help, a business arrangement. And now? Now I can't imagine this place without you." He guided the team around a drift. "Can't imagine myself without you." Margaret pulled her shawl tighter, but not from cold. "I came here running from the past, but somewhere along the way, I stopped running and started building. So did I." They reached the ranch as the snow stopped, leaving the world crystalline under starlight. Thomas helped Margaret down from the wagon, and for a moment they stood close, his hands on her waist, her hands on his shoulders. "Ask me again," she said softly. "About the wedding. Ask me in spring, when the world's turning green again." "I will." It was a promise. Winter passed in quiet contentment. They faced blizzards that trapped them for days, managed livestock through brutal cold, dealt with frozen pumps and dwindling supplies. But every challenge met together strengthened the bond between them. Thomas smiled more now, even laughed on occasion. Margaret hummed as she worked, filling the house with small warmths, bread rising, soup simmering, curtains she'd sewn for every window. The house that had been a fortress slowly became a home. In March, with spring still a distant promise, Margaret woke to find Thomas already up, standing at the window. "What is it?" "Riders, but don't worry. It's the Olsen boys. Probably need help with calving." She joined him at the window, and he put his arm around her shoulders, natural as breathing. They stood together watching the riders approach, no longer defensive, but welcoming. "I've been thinking," Thomas said, "about what Hartwell offered, about spring coming." "Yes?" He turned to face her, taking both her hands. "Margaret Harper, you came here as a stranger and became my salvation. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Truly and completely?" She studied his face, scarred but dear now, weathered but trusted. "Yes, Thomas Caldwell, I believe I will." He kissed her then, their first real kiss, gentle and sure as spring's eventual arrival. Outside, the Olsen boys were hollering about a calf stuck in a drift. But for just that moment, the world held only two people who'd found their way through violence and loss to something worth defending. April brought the wedding, the whole town turning out to witness what everyone already knew, that Thomas Caldwell and Margaret Harper belonged together. They spoke their vows in the church this time, Margaret in her new dress and Thomas in his cleaned uniform. The last time he'd wear it. "Do you, Thomas, take this woman?" "I do." No hesitation now. "Do you, Margaret, take this man?" "I do." Clear and certain. Afterward, at the reception in that same barn where they danced at Christmas, Morrison raised a toast. "To Thomas and Margaret Caldwell. They came through fire and found each other. May their future be peaceful as their past was turbulent." "Hear, hear," the crowd responded, but Thomas caught Margaret's eye and smiled. They both knew peace was relative on the frontier. There would be other challenges, droughts and floods, sickness and loss, the thousand dangers of making a life in untamed country. But they would face them together, no longer running from the past but building toward the future. Two people who'd learned that sometimes love came not as lightning but as spring, slow, patient, inevitable, worth the wait. As the sun set over the mountains and the celebration continued around them, Thomas and Margaret stepped outside for a moment of quiet. Their ranch lay in the distance, waiting for their return. "No regrets?" Thomas asked. "None," Margaret answered. "You? Only that it took so long to find you." She leaned into his strength, he into her warmth. Behind them, music spilled from the barn. Before them, the mountains stood eternal against the darkening sky. And in that moment, on that frontier where anything could happen, they had everything they needed. Home, hope, each other. It was enough. It was everything. Thank you for listening to this Wild West love story. Where are you enjoying this tale from? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to connect with listeners from around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about Thomas and Margaret's journey. What did you think of their story? We'd love to hear from you.